Madam President, I rise in support of Attorney General Scott Pruitt to be the next administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency. And I think it's important, as we are continuing this debate, to make a couple things perfectly clear. We all, like my good friend from Delaware, who's been leading the debate, we all believe in clean water, clean air, how important that is to all Americans. Certainly important to my state, which has some of the cleanest water, cleanest air, most pristine environment in the world. So certainly I don't think any of us debate that. We all agree on properly disposing of waste, cleaning up contaminated sites. And just this past year, Congress passed very dramatic legislation, very important, bipartisan, by the way, out of the Environment and Public Works Committee, the Toxic Substance Control Act, TSCA, which does that. And I think most of us agree that the EPA has an important role in ensuring we have clean water within the authority granted to that agency by Congress. So, I think the vast majority of this body agree with that. But as I've been listening to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle and their criticism of Attorney General Scott Pruitt, you know, one of the things, Madam President, that's not come up over the past 24 hours in this debate, as a matter of fact, on the EPW committee on which I sit for the past 2 years, I don't think I've heard my colleagues on the other side of the aisle ever talk about this issue. And it's a really important issue for the country. It's the rule of law. It's the rule of law and the U.S. Constitution. And we've been debating Scott Pruitt's nomination for a while now, but not one of my colleagues has uttered that phrase. Not one. Even though many of my colleagues are lawyers and former law professors and former attorneys general themselves. So why is this important? Why is this important? To have a debate on the rule of law when we're looking at Scott Pruitt's nomination? Well, I think it's incredibly important. Because if you look at the EPA's actions and activities and focus over the last 8 years, it has not been an agency that's focused on the rule of law. In many ways, it's been a lawless agency, a rogue agency. And so when we're having this debate, we need to put the debate of Scott Pruitt's nomination and confirmation in the context of what's happened over the last 8 years. We've had an agency in the EPA that doesn't listen to states, even though it's required to by federal law, that ignores the rule of law, as evidenced by numerous federal court decisions rebuking it, and that believes it has the power to regulate every nook and cranny of American life, every economic activity of Americans. That's literally what we have right now with regard to our current EPA. Now, this is not just one senator making this claim. It has become the conventional wisdom and the common narrative with regard to this EPA in the last 8 years by a variety of federal courts and law professors throughout the country. So, Madam President, let me provide a few examples. A number of my colleagues have talked about the waters of the U.S. rule, WOTUS, and how this aggressive, far-reaching rule claims authority, the EPA claims authority, to regulate literally puddles and irrigation ditches throughout the country. An enormous power grab. So a number of us were concerned about this. In hearings and in letters, I asked the previous EPA administrator, Gina McCarthy, where she got the legal authority to do this. It's a pretty big deal. Took months to get an answer. And states, under the law, are supposed to be consulted on this issue. States like my state, the great state of Alaska, they weren't consulted. They were ignored. So what happened? What happened? 32 states, bipartisan by the way, including Alaska, sued the EPA over this law, over this regulation, the waters of the U.S. Now, Madam President, this is a critical point. Cooperative federalism. That's another term I've heard very little of in this debate, is the bedrock of environmental laws like the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. The principle establishes that the states and the EPA are partners. Indeed, under these federal laws, the states are the primary protector and implementer of our environmental protection laws. That's in the law. That's in the federal law. But for the past 8 years, the EPA has consistently ignored this on major rules. The most dramatic is right here. The waters of the U.S., 32 states sued to stop the EPA on this regulation. And what happened in the lawsuit? The Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals put a stay on the entire rule, expressing serious doubts about its legality. So that's one instance on a big deal. Let's look at another one, the so-called Clean Power Plan. And I know the presiding officer has talked about this and how it's very concerning for her state of West Virginia. And whatever your views are on climate change and the appropriate response, there should be no debate in this body that we have to address this issue in a way that is consistent with the U.S. Constitution and rule of law. No debate. But again, I never hear anyone talk about the rule of law on the other side. So this rule is promulgated, and once again, the EPA, in the promulgation of this rule, took actions that courts and commentators across the political spectrum viewed as likely another illegal rule by the EPA. So like the waters of the U.S. rule, numerous states and others sued to stop the Clean Power Plan rule, which the EPA claimed somehow they had the authority to regulate almost the entire U.S. energy sector. Look at the rule. That's what they're claiming, that Congress somehow gave them that power. Now, in a previous Supreme Court case called Utility Air Regulators, which was a lawsuit against the EPA, and at the time I was serving as Attorney General for the state of Alaska and was one of the AGs who initiated this suit. The EPA lost that one in the Supreme Court, and Justice Scalia, in writing the majority opinion, stated, quote, "When an agency, the EPA, claims to discover in a long extant statute an unheralded power to regulate a significant portion of the American economy, we typically greet its announcement with a measure of skepticism. We expect Congress to speak clearly if it wishes to assign an agency's decisions of vast economic and political significance." In other words, EPA, you didn't have the power to regulate a huge swath of the American economy, so the Supreme Court struck that down. Utility air regulators versus EPA. So it wasn't surprising that with regard to the Clean Power Plan regulation, the Supreme Court of the United States put a stay on that rule. The Supreme Court of the United States put a stay on that rule before any other court, any other lower court, a district court, a court of appeals, had heard the arguments on that rule. Think about that. You know how many times in U.S. history that's happened? You know how many times in the history of the U.S. Supreme Court that's happened? Never before. First time in the history of the Supreme Court that it saw a rule that it probably felt was so egregious that it put a stay on it before any other court ruled on that rule. Pretty dramatic. Pretty remarkable. Clearly, the U.S. Supreme Court has serious doubts about whether the EPA is acting in a lawful manner on the Clean Power Plan. And Madam President, if you think it's just conservative jurists and lawyers and senators who hold that view, you would be mistaken. Here's what Lawrence Tribe said about the EPA's authority with regard to the Clean Power Plan. Now, for those of you who don't know Lawrence Tribe, he is a very well-respected constitutional law professor at Harvard, but very liberal. He was President Obama's law professor, but he's well-respected. Here's what he said about the EPA's authority on this very important regulation. He wrote in challenging the Clean Power Plan, quote, "Even more fundamentally, the EPA, like every administrative agency, is constitutionally forbidden to exercise powers Congress never delegated to it in the first place. The brute fact is that the Obama administration failed to get climate legislation through Congress. Yet the EPA is acting as though it has the legislative authority anyway to re-engineer the nation's electrical generating system and power grid. It does not have this power," unquote. That's Lawrence Tribe. He later testified in front of the House Energy and Commerce Committee in 2015 that with regard to this regulation, quote, "The EPA is attempting to exercise lawmaking power that belongs to Congress and the judicial power that belongs to the federal courts. Burning the Constitution should not be part of our national energy policy. EPA is attempting an unconstitutional trifecta, usurping the prerogatives of the states, Congress, and the federal courts all at once," unquote. That's Lawrence Tribe. That's Harvard professor Lawrence Tribe, who believes the EPA is clearly acting in an unconstitutional manner. But, Madam President, it's not just losing in court and in the realm of both conservative and liberal legal public opinion. It has been the way the EPA leadership, from the top to its foot soldiers, has treated the American people over the last 8 years. The American people that the EPA is supposed to serve. That treatment can be described in many ways as with disdain. Let me provide a few examples of that. On the eve of another Supreme Court case, which the EPA lost, this was EPA versus Michigan, EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy was asked on a TV show, did she think she was going to win the case? Now, she responded, as you would think most administrators would. She said yes. I think we're going to win. Okay, that's fine. She probably believed it, had good lawyers telling her that. But then she went on to say this, but even if we don't win, it was 3 years ago. Most of the companies are already in compliance. Investments have been made. We'll catch up. Think about that quote. This is the head of the EPA, essentially saying, even if we lose, we win. We're the federal government. We don't have to abide by the law. Those companies and American citizens who are abiding by the law, who are abiding by the regulations, they already made investments, hundreds of millions. They're stuck. We win. Heads we win, tails we win. That is a remarkable statement by the leader of a federal agency that shows disdain for the law. Let me give you another example. My colleague and good friend from Colorado came down and talked about the Animas River and what happened there. Okay, clearly a mistake. I don't believe that the EPA meant to do that, to spill millions of gallons of toxic waste into a river. But in a hearing in the EPW committee, I asked the administrator, well, are you going to hold the EPA officials who did that to the same standard you would the private sector? Because in the private sector, in similar kind of activities, the EPA has actually criminally charged people for doing something like that. Negligence. Criminally charged them. She looked at me and said, Senator, not only are we going to hold ourselves to that standard, we're going to hold ourselves to a higher standard. Okay, that's a pretty good answer. So what's happened on the Animas River with the EPA holding themselves to a higher standard. Remember, they put people in jail for doing this. Was anyone held responsible? Was anyone criminally charged? Anyone go to jail? Of course not. Nothing happened. And in my state, Madam President, the EPA's disdain for my constituents has manifested itself in a couple of remarkable ways. First, we had the former administrator, Gina McCarthy in Alaska, visiting after she came into office, and there was a big Wall Street Journal article on her visit, talked about it, and when she was given some gifts by Alaskans, my constituents, the people she serves. When she was given gifts from my constituents on her visit to my state, she was later asked by a reporter what she did with them according to the government ethics rules. Here's a quote from that story, Wall Street Journal. Gina McCarthy had been surprised by the government ethics bureaucracy and its gift guidelines, remarking how officials chased her down for a dinky North Pole, that's a community in Alaska, pin that someone gave her at an event as a gift. Quote, "I threw the effing thing away," she stated. And with regard to another gift she got, a jar of moose meat, from a young girl at a hearing in Alaska, she said, quote, "That gift could have gagged a maggot." Just a leader of an agency, serving the people, and yet she's doing it in a way that's clearly disrespectful. Let me talk about another incident in Alaska. In a place called Chicken, Alaska, where we have placer miners out mining. Small mining operations, family businesses, mining for gold. The EPA thought there was going to be some Clean Water Act violations, which they never found. So what they do, they didn't talk to the local community. They did a raid. Body armor, assault weapons. My constituents, a raid, a military assault to find clean water violations, which they never found, and they never apologized for the raid. Now, Madam President, you might ask, what does all this have to do with the nomination of Attorney General Pruitt? My answer is everything. Everything. He understands that the EPA needs a serious course correction, that it must get back to listening to the states and following the rule of law, and most importantly, regaining the trust of the American people, which has been lost over the last 8 years due to some of the actions I just described. The American people see this. They see statements like this, and they know that this has been an agency that has not been acting in their interest and not been acting according to the law. Not only does Attorney General Pruitt understand this, he emphasized this during his confirmation hearing, 6 hours long, which I sat through the entire thing. So let me conclude by reading a few excerpts of his opening statement. And the American people need to hear this, because this is what Attorney General Pruitt's going to do when he leads the EPA. He said his priorities were, first, under our Constitution, the role the EPA plays in protecting the environment is defined by statute, just as statutes limit every federal agency. Members of this body, the Senate, and the House of Representatives have worked tirelessly over decades to set the balance in environmental policies through laws that have been passed. The EPA's role is to administer those laws faithfully. As Attorney General of Oklahoma, he stated, I saw examples where the agency became dissatisfied with the tools Congress has given it to address certain issues and bootstrapped its own powers and tools through rulemaking. This, unfortunately, has only resulted in protracted litigation where the courts suspended most of these rules after years of delay. In the meantime, we lost the opportunity for true environmental protection as a nation. This approach is not right. So getting back to the rule of law, that's number one for Attorney General Pruitt. Second, he said, cooperative federalism must be respected and applied by the EPA with regard to our environmental laws. Congress has wisely and appropriately directed the EPA through our environmental statutes to utilize the expertise and resources of the states to better protect the environment and for the states to remain our nation's frontline environmental implementers and enforcers. If we truly want to advance and achieve cleaner air and water, the states must be partners, not mere passive instruments of federal will. If confirmed, I will utilize the relationships I have forged with my counterparts in the states to ensure that the EPA returns to its proper role, rather than using a heavy hand to coerce states into effectuating EPA policies. Cooperative federalism, that's in the law, and he wants to uphold it. Third and finally, he said, it is critical to me that the EPA also truly listen to the diverse views of the American people and learn from them. If confirmed as administrator, I am committed to ensuring EPA's decisions are conducted through an open process that take into account the full range of views of the American people, including the economic consequences of any regulation. Environmental regulations do not occur in a vacuum, he stated. We can simultaneously pursue the mutual goals of environmental protection and economic growth. But that can only happen if the EPA listens to the views of all interested stakeholders, including the states, so that it can determine how to realize its mission while considering the pragmatic impacts its decisions has on jobs, communities, and most importantly, families. Finally, Madam President, in his closing of his opening statement, Attorney General Pruitt said this: my time as Attorney General of Oklahoma afforded me the opportunity to travel my state, meeting farmers, ranchers, landowners, and small business owners of all sorts. These are good people, hard-working Americans who want to do the right thing by the environment. They want the air that their children breathe and the waters in which they swim to be clean. They want to follow the law. But recently, they have felt hopeless, subject to a never-ending torrent of new regulations that only a lawyer can understand. They fear the EPA, and that just shouldn't be the case. If confirmed, I will work tirelessly to ensure that the EPA acts lawfully, sensibly, and with those hard-working Americans ever in mind, unquote. That's how he ended his testimony. Madam President, Scott Pruitt is the right person to lead the EPA. We've gotten to the point, as he noted in his testimony, where millions of Americans, including some of my constituents, in Chicken, Alaska certainly, have come to fear their own federal government, especially when it acts in a lawless fashion. He is exactly the right person with the right qualifications and the right emphasis to fix this problem, and I encourage all of my colleagues to support the confirmation vote we are going to make on him in a few hours. I yield the floor.